What do you do when your family sets 12 plates for Christmas dinner, but not one of them is yours? When you discover your brother has been recording himself laughing about how easy it is to manipulate your own mother against you, and when you finally decide to give him a Christmas gift, he'll never forget. This is the story of the day. I stopped begging for a seat at their table and built my own instead. It was 3 p.m. sharp when I pulled into my parents' driveway on Christmas Day. The snow was falling in those perfect Instagram-worthy flakes that made everything look like a Hallmark movie. The house stood before me like a suburban palace, every window framed with twinkling lights, positioned with mathematical precision. Mom had outdone herself this year. The wreaths were perfectly centered, the garland draped like it came straight out of a Pinterest board. Even the mailbox had a little red bow. I sat there for a moment, engine off, watching the golden light spill from the living room windows. Through the frost-kissed glass, I could see shadows moving around inside. My family, laughing, preparing, living their lives in that warm bubble I'd always felt locked out of. In my passenger seat sat a homemade apple pie still warm from my oven wrapped in my grandmother's old kitchen towel, the one with tiny strawberries that she'd used every Sunday when I was little. Next to it, a carefully arranged stack of gifts I'd spent weeks picking out, each one chosen with the kind of hope that felt both familiar and foolish. For Zach, my older brother, I'd found a vintage leather journal with his initials embossed on the cover. He'd mentioned once, maybe 2 Christmases ago, that he wanted to write. For Sophie, my baby sister, a first edition copy of her favorite childhood book. And for Mom and Dad, a framed photo from our last real family vacation, before everything got so complicated. But there was something else for Zach, something special wrapped in innocent Christmas paper that held the weight of years inside it. My fingers traced the edge of that particular package, and I felt my heart skip in that dangerous way that meant I was about to do something I couldn't take back. My phone buzzed. Mila's name lit up the screen. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I stared at her message for a long moment. Mila had been my rock for the past 3 years, ever since I'd started therapy with Dr. Kwan. She'd watched me unpack decades of family dysfunction, helped me recognize the patterns I'd been blind to for so long. She knew what was in that special gift for Zach, and she knew what it might cost me. I typed back, "I need closure." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. "Finally, I love you. I'm here when you're ready." I tucked the phone away and looked back at the house. This was the same driveway where I'd learned to ride a bike, where Zach had pushed me off that bike when I was 7, where Dad had taught me to drive in his old Honda when I was 16. Every crack in the concrete held a memory, and most of them hurt. But here's the thing about hope. It's persistent. It's stupid. It shows up uninvited even when experience has taught you better. And as I gathered my gifts and my pie and my fragile expectations, I felt it blooming in my chest again. That familiar whisper, maybe this time will be different. Maybe this year they'll finally see me. I'd been having that same thought for 28 years. Let me tell you about my family, because you need to understand the ecosystem I was walking into. There's Zach, 31, the golden boy who could do no wrong. Successful real estate developer married to his college sweetheart, Amanda, owner of a Tesla, and a personality that commanded every room he entered. He was the son my parents bragged about at neighborhood barbecues, the one whose achievements got framed and hung on the hallway walls. Then there's Sophie, 24, the baby who could do no wrong for entirely different reasons. Art student turned yoga instructor with that effortless beauty that made strangers stop her on the street. She was the daughter my parents worried about in that fond, protective way that made her problems seem charming rather than serious. And then there was me, Niki, the middle child, the journalist who'd spent her career asking hard questions and digging for truth, but who somehow became invisible the moment she walked through her childhood front door. I was the ghost in the middle, the one who got forgotten in family photos and overlooked in family conversations. I'd learned to make peace with it mostly. I'd built a life in the city, found work that mattered, surrounded myself with people who saw my worth. But blood is blood, and Christmas is Christmas. And some part of me always believed that if I just tried hard enough, showed up consistently enough, loved them unconditionally enough, they might finally make room for me at their table. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked up the familiar path. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted with the history of every Christmas that had come before this one. Every year I'd arrived with hope. Every year I'd left a little more broken. But this year was going to be different. Not because they were going to change, but because I was carrying something that would force everything into the light. The truth has a way of doing that. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for convenient timing. It just sits there patient and persistent until someone finally has the courage to unwrap it. I reached for the doorbell, then stopped. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I could hear laughter. Zach's booming voice telling some story, probably about his latest business success. Sophie's musical giggle in response. Mom's delighted. "Oh, Zachary!" in that tone she reserved for her favorite child. For just a moment, I considered turning around, going home to my quiet apartment with its teal walls and peace lily plants. Mila would make us hot chocolate, and we'd watch old movies, and I'd avoid another year of feeling like a stranger in my own family. But I'd been running from this moment for too long. Some gifts can only be given once, and some truths can only be told when you're brave enough to bear the consequences. I rang the doorbell and waited, holding my pie like armor, and my secrets like weapons, ready to find out which one would serve me better. The door opened, and there was Mom, her blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing the red cashmere sweater I'd given her last Christmas. She looked genuinely surprised to see me, which should have been my first warning sign. "Oh, Niki, you made it." Her voice carried that particular tone I'd grown up with. Not quite disappointment, not quite relief, just a kind of resigned acknowledgement that I existed. "Of course I made it, Mom. It's Christmas." She took my pie with a distracted, "Thank you, sweetie," and ushered me inside, already turning her attention back to whatever crisis was happening in the kitchen. I stood there in the entryway, still holding my stack of gifts, watching her disappear around the corner like I was just another package that had been delivered. Standing there in that familiar hallway, surrounded by the same family photos that had hung there for decades, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was the way Mom had looked right through me. Or maybe it was the sound of Zach's laughter echoing from the living room. But suddenly, I was 7 years old again, standing in this exact same spot, trying to understand why nothing I did ever seemed to matter. It's funny how a house can hold so much history. Every corner, every creaky floorboard, every faded mark on the doorframe where Dad had measured our heights each year. But some memories cut deeper than others, and as I hung my coat in the hall closet, they started flooding back with a clarity that made my chest tight. I was 6 years old the first time I realized that love in our family wasn't distributed equally. It was the first grade science fair, and I'd spent weeks working on my volcano project. I'd painted the papier-mâché mountain myself, mixed the baking soda and vinegar solution, practiced my presentation until I could recite it in my sleep. I was so proud of that little volcano. The night before the fair, I went to bed early, my project sitting safely on the kitchen counter, ready for its big moment. But when I woke up the next morning, there was red paint splattered across the base, and one side had been crushed in. My volcano looked like it had been in an actual eruption. I remember standing there in my pajamas, staring at the wreckage, trying not to cry. Zach wandered into the kitchen, took one look at my destroyed project, and shrugged. "Accidents happen," he said. But there was something in his eyes that didn't look accidental at all. Mom found me crying and patted my head absently. "Oh, honey, these things happen. Maybe next year you'll be more careful about where you leave your projects." But here's the thing that still haunts me about that day. While I was trying to salvage my broken volcano with tape and desperate hope Dad was in the garage with Zach putting the finishing touches on a solar system model that looked like it belonged in a museum. They'd been working on it together for weeks, apparently. Every planet perfectly painted, every orbit precisely calculated. Zach won first place. I didn't even get an honorable mention. That night at dinner, Dad raised his glass in a toast, To Zach, our little scientist, everyone clapped. My volcano sat in the trash can outside, covered by coffee grounds and yesterday's newspaper. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody asked how my day had gone. That was the first time I learned that in our family, Zach's successes were family victories, and my failures were just mine to carry. The pattern repeated itself for years in ways both big and small. When I made honor roll in fourth grade, the certificate got stuck to the refrigerator for exactly 3 days before it disappeared under soccer schedules and grocery lists. When Zach made honor roll, Mom called Grandma to brag, and Dad took him out for ice cream to celebrate. When I scored the winning goal in my middle school soccer championship, I came home bubbling with excitement, ready to share my moment of triumph. But Zach had just gotten his driver's license that same day, and suddenly the house was all about him and his newfound freedom. My trophy sat on my dresser, celebrated by an audience of one. But it was high school when things got really cruel. I was 15 and had never been asked to a dance. Not because I wasn't pretty enough or smart enough, but because I'd somehow developed a reputation as the weird girl, the one who asked too many questions in class and spent lunch periods reading in the library. I'd made peace with it mostly until Tommy Richardson asked me to homecoming. Tommy was sweet and funny with kind eyes and a nervous laugh that made me feel seen for the first time in my teenage life. When he asked me standing by my locker after English class, I felt like maybe high school wasn't going to be the lonely wasteland I'd resigned myself to. I spent weeks preparing. Mom actually took me shopping for a dress, a rare moment of mother-daughter bonding that made me hope things were changing between us. I found a deep blue dress that made me feel beautiful, got my hair done at the salon where Sophie later would become a regular, and for the first time in my life, I felt like maybe I belonged. 2 days before the dance, Tommy called me. His voice was different, distant. "Hey, Niki, I can't take you to homecoming anymore. Something came up." "What kind of something?" "Just something. I'm sorry." He hung up before I could ask any more questions. I sat there holding the phone, staring at my beautiful blue dress hanging on my closet door, feeling like someone had hollowed out my chest with a spoon. It wasn't until Monday at school that I found out what had really happened. Tommy's best friend Jake let it slip in the hallway. "Man, I can't believe Zach told him that stuff about you. That's harsh, even for Zach." "What stuff?" Jake's face went pale when he realized what he'd said. "Nothing. Forget it." But I pressed him until he finally told me. Zach had cornered Tommy at a party I hadn't been invited to and filled his head with lies. Told him I was easy, that I'd slept around, that taking me to homecoming would ruin his reputation. None of it was true. I'd barely been kissed, let alone anything else. But Tommy believed it because why would Zach lie about his own sister? When I confronted Zach about it later, he just shrugged. I was protecting him. "You're weird, Niki. You would have made it awkward for everyone." I told Mom what had happened, expecting her to be furious to defend me to make Zach apologize. Instead, she sighed and said those words that would become her signature response to every injustice I'd face. "Just let it go, Niki. This isn't worth the drama." But the worst part wasn't losing Tommy, or missing homecoming, or even Zach's casual cruelty. It was watching my parents brush it off like it didn't matter. Like I didn't matter enough to fight for. College was supposed to be my fresh start. Away from Zach's shadow, away from the suffocating dynamics of our house, I finally found my voice. I joined the newspaper, made real friends, discovered that I was actually pretty good at making people laugh when I wasn't walking on eggshells. And I fell in love. Her name was Rachel, and she was everything I hadn't known I was looking for. Smart and passionate and brave in ways that made me want to be braver too. She was studying environmental science, and she talked about saving the world with such conviction that I almost believed she could do it. She had curly red hair and freckles across her nose, and when she kissed me for the first time behind the library during finals week, I felt like my whole life suddenly made sense. I was 20 and in love, and tired of hiding pieces of myself to make other people comfortable. So when I came home for Christmas break, I brought Rachel with me. I should have known better. The moment we walked through the front door, I could feel the temperature in the room drop. Dad's handshake was stiff and formal. Mom's smile was so tight it looked painful, but it was Zach who really went for the throat. So, Rachel, he said at dinner, cutting into his ham with surgical precision, what do your parents think about you being gay? I'm bisexual, actually, Rachel replied calmly, though I could see her knuckles whiten as she gripped her fork. Right, Zach said with a smirk. Bisexual? That's convenient. Can't decide, huh? The silence that followed was deafening. I waited for anyone to tell Zach that was inappropriate, to stand up for Rachel for me for basic human decency. Instead, Dad cleared his throat and said, "Let's not ruin the holidays." That phrase would become his default response to everything. Zach's cruelty, Mom's passive aggression, my desperate attempts to be heard. Let's not ruin the holidays, as if my pain was the real problem, not the behavior that caused it. Rachel lasted through dessert before excusing herself to our room. I found her packing. I can't do this, Niki. I won't sit there and let him talk to us like that. Please don't go. They'll come around. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. They wouldn't come around because they didn't want to. My sexuality was just another inconvenience, another way I'd failed to be the daughter they'd ordered. Rachel left the next morning. We tried to make it work long distance for a few more months, but something had broken between us that night. She'd seen my family, seen how small I became in their presence, and she couldn't unsee it. You deserve better than people who make you disappear, she told me during our last phone call. I just wish you believed that. Years passed. I graduated, started my career, built a life that didn't require their approval. But somehow, I kept coming back. Kept hoping that this time would be different. That this Christmas, this birthday, this random Tuesday dinner would be the moment they finally saw me. Every achievement I earned felt diminished in their presence. When I won my first journalism award, Mom mentioned it to her book club as an afterthought. When Zach bought his second rental property, there was a celebration dinner with champagne and toasts. When I got promoted to senior editor, Mom forgot to congratulate me. When Zach got a new client, Dad posted about it on Facebook with 3 exclamation points. The pattern was so consistent it became background noise. Zach's wins were family wins. My wins were mine alone. Zach's mistakes were learning experiences. My mistakes were character flaws. When Zach got arrested for drunk driving at 25, Mom spent weeks on the phone with lawyers, bailing him out, making excuses. He's under so much pressure with work. She'd tell anyone who'd listen. When I got a speeding ticket that same year, she lectured me about responsibility and making better choices. It was like living in an alternate reality where the rules only applied to me. Just let it go, Niki. This isn't worth the drama. How many times had I heard those words? How many injustices had I swallowed because fighting back would be dramatic? How many times had I made myself smaller to accommodate their comfort? But standing there in that hallway on Christmas Day, holding my carefully chosen gifts and my carefully guarded hope, I realized something had shifted. Maybe it was the therapy, maybe it was the distance, maybe it was just exhaustion from carrying this weight for so long. I wasn't that little girl with the broken volcano anymore. I wasn't the teenager whose date got scared away by lies. I wasn't the college student whose love was treated like a phase. I was a grown woman with a successful career and healthy relationships and a life that mattered. And I was done making myself small for people who had never bothered to make room for me in the first place. The sound of Zach's laughter drifted down the hallway, followed by Mom's delighted response. Some things never change, but some things do. And today, I was going to find out which was which. I walked toward the living room, but before joining the family chaos, I needed a moment to remember who I'd become outside these walls. Because the truth is, I'd built a life that mattered, a life that had nothing to do with their approval or their absence of it. It started 3 years ago when I broke the story that changed everything for me professionally. I'd been working as a junior reporter for the city paper covering city council meetings and local business openings when I stumbled across something that didn't add up. Housing permits were being fast-tracked for certain developers, while others waited months for approval. The pattern was subtle, but it was there. I spent 4 months following paper trails, conducting interviews, staying late in archives that smelled like dust and forgotten promises. My editor thought I was wasting time. Housing permits aren't sexy, Niki. Find something people actually care about. But I knew this mattered. Families were being displaced. Affordable housing was being blocked, and money was changing hands in ways that weren't showing up in public records. So I kept digging, kept asking questions, kept following threads that everyone else ignored. The night I finally cracked it, I sat in my tiny studio apartment at 2 a.m. staring at bank statements and email chains that painted a picture of corruption so clear it took my breath away. City council members were taking bribes. Housing developments for low-income families were being blocked while luxury condos got rubber stamped. Millions of dollars were being funneled through shell companies, and vulnerable families were paying the price. My story ran on the front page of our paper, then got picked up by the state news network, then went national. Within a week, I was being interviewed on cable news shows, and within a month, 3 city officials had resigned in disgrace. The FBI opened an investigation. Families who'd been waiting years for housing finally got answers. I remember calling my parents the day the story broke nationally. I was so proud, so excited to share this moment with them. For once, I had something undeniably impressive to offer. "Mom, did you see the news? My story is everywhere." "That's nice, honey. Your father's trying to watch his game, though. Can we talk later?" Later never came. When I brought it up at the next family dinner, Mom nodded absently and immediately changed the subject to ask Sophie about her yoga teacher certification. The story that had consumed my life for months, that had changed the course of my career, that had actually helped people got the same response as if I'd mentioned what I had for lunch. But something had shifted in me during those months of investigation. For the first time in my life, I'd had a voice that people listened to. I'd asked hard questions and gotten real answers. I'd mattered in a way that wasn't dependent on anyone else's recognition. With my first real paycheck from the national coverage, I did something I'd never imagined possible. I bought my own place. It wasn't much a one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a converted brownstone, but it was mine. I painted the walls teal, a color that made me think of ocean peace and new beginnings. I bought plants, real plants that I kept alive and thriving. A peace lily by the window, a snake plant in the corner trailing pothos that cascaded from shelves I installed myself. For the first time in my life, I had a space that was entirely mine. No one else's opinions, no one else's rules, no one else's expectations. I could eat cereal for dinner if I wanted. I could play music too loud. I could have friends over without worrying about someone else's judgment. I remember the first night I spent there sitting on my secondhand couch, looking around at my teal walls and my plants and my books arranged exactly how I wanted them. I felt something I'd never experienced before in a living space. I felt at home. But old patterns die hard, and I still found myself seeking their approval, still hoping for scraps of recognition from the people who'd raised me. Last Thanksgiving, I made the mistake of trying again. I'd been promoted to senior investigative reporter, won a regional journalism award, and was working on a story about environmental contamination that could potentially save lives. I walked into that same dining room, ready to share my successes, ready to finally be seen. Zach dominated the conversation as usual. He'd just flipped his 3rd condo and was describing the granite countertops he'd installed, the hardwood floors. He'd refinished the profit margins that made Dad's eyes light up with pride. "The market's incredible right now," Zach said, gesturing with his wine glass. "I bought this place for $80K, put maybe $15K into renovations, and sold it for $140K. 6 weeks total." "That's my son," Dad beamed. "Always had a head for business." I waited for a lull in the conversation, then tried to share my news. "I got promoted last month. They gave me my own investigative unit." "That's wonderful, honey," Mom said absently, then immediately turned to Sophie. "Sophie, tell us about your new dog. I saw the pictures on Instagram. He's adorable." Just like that, the conversation shifted to Sophie's golden retriever puppy, his training schedule, his favorite toys, his adorable habit of sleeping upside down. For 20 minutes, the table was captivated by puppy stories, while my career milestone evaporated into background noise. I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, watching my family's faces light up over a dog, while my professional achievement was dismissed in the span of a heartbeat. It wasn't malicious exactly. It was worse than that. It was indifference. I was so used to being overlooked that even my good news couldn't break through their pattern of not seeing me. That night, I called Mila from my car in their driveway, crying so hard I could barely speak. "I'm so stupid," I sobbed. "Why do I keep doing this to myself?" "You're not stupid," Mila said gently. "You're human. You want your family to love you. That's not stupid, that's normal." "But they don't? They never will? Not the real me anyway." "Then maybe it's time to stop trying to be someone else for them." That conversation led me to Dr. Kwan's office 3 weeks later. I'd never done therapy before. The idea of paying someone to listen to my problems felt self-indulgent, like admitting defeat. But I was tired of carrying the weight of their indifference, tired of the way every family interaction left me feeling hollowed out and questioning my own worth. Dr. Kwan was a small woman with kind eyes and an office filled with plants that reminded me of my apartment. She had a way of asking questions that made me really think about patterns I'd never examined before. "Tell me about your family," she said during our first session. I launched into the usual script. "They're good people, really. I'm probably just too sensitive. I should be grateful for everything they've given me." "What have they given you?" The question caught me off guard. I sat there for a long moment, trying to come up with an answer. A roof over my head growing up. Food. Education. "Those are basic parental responsibilities," Dr. Kwan said gently. "What else?" I couldn't think of anything else. Not emotional support, not encouragement, not validation, not unconditional love. Just the bare minimum required to keep a child alive and functional. "It sounds like you've been trying very hard to earn something that should have been freely given," Dr. Kwan observed. Over the months that followed, she helped me untangle the web of dysfunction I'd grown up in. She helped me see that Zach's behavior wasn't just sibling rivalry, it was systematic sabotage. That Mom's dismissiveness wasn't just personality, it was emotional neglect. That Dad's refusal to intervene wasn't peacekeeping, it was enabling. Most importantly, she helped me understand that none of it was my fault. "You keep trying to shrink yourself to fit into their idea of who you should be," she said during one particularly breakthrough session. "But what if the problem isn't your size? What if the problem is the size of the space they're offering you?" That's when she said the words that changed everything for me. "You don't have to shrink to fit at someone else's table, Niki. You can build your own table." Build my own table. The phrase hit me like a revelation. I'd spent my entire life begging for a seat at theirs, accepting scraps, making myself smaller and smaller to accommodate their comfort. But what if I stopped? What if I just stepped away and built something better? I started small. I stopped calling as often. I stopped sharing my achievements with them, choosing instead to celebrate with friends who actually cared. I stopped making excuses for their behavior or trying to manage their feelings about my existence. The funny thing was, they barely noticed. My reduced presence in their lives created hardly a ripple, which told me everything I needed to know about how much space I'd actually been taking up. But I noticed. I felt lighter. The constant anxiety about saying the wrong thing, being the wrong way, wanting the wrong things, it started to fade. I began to remember who I was when I wasn't performing for their approval. I was kind. I was funny. I was smart. I was brave enough to ask hard questions and persistent enough to find real answers. I was a good friend, a loyal partner, a competent professional. I mattered in ways that had nothing to do with their opinion of me. The night before this Christmas gathering, Mila and I were curled up on my couch, her feet tucked under my legs, both of us reading. My peace lily had grown so tall it nearly touched the ceiling, and the trailing pothos had spread across half the wall. My little apartment had become a sanctuary filled with life I'd nurtured and beauty I'd chosen. "You know you don't have to go tomorrow," Mila said without looking up from her book. "I know." "So why are you going?" I set down my book and looked around my teal-walled haven, this space I'd created for myself, this life I'd built from scratch. "Because I'm done shrinking. This Christmas, I'm going to show up. Not as the desperate child begging for scraps of love. Not as the teenager trying to prove her worth. Not as the adult making herself small to accommodate their comfort. I was going to show up as exactly who I'd become. And if that was too much for them to handle well, that said everything about them and nothing about me. The woman I'd become didn't need their permission to exist. She didn't need their approval to have value. She had her own table now, surrounded by people who saw her worth, and she wasn't going to abandon it for the illusion of belonging somewhere she'd never actually been welcome. But first, she had one last gift to give. One final truth to tell. One more chance to see if they were capable of change, and if not, one final goodbye to the family that had never quite learned how to love her. I was done shrinking. Today, I was going to find out what happened when I finally stood at my full height. I took a deep breath and walked into the living room, my carefully wrapped gifts balanced in my arms, ready to embrace whatever version of Christmas my family had prepared this year. The room was exactly as I'd expected. Perfectly decorated, every ornament positioned with mathematical precision, the tree so flawless it could have been featured in a magazine spread. Zach was holding court from his usual position on Dad's recliner, gesturing animatedly as he told some story about his latest real estate conquest. Amanda sat beside him on the arm of the chair, her perfectly manicured hand resting on his shoulder, laughing at appropriate intervals like a well-trained audience member. Sophie was curled up on the couch in a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, scrolling through her phone while pretending to listen. Dad sat in his designated spot, nodding along to Zach's story with the kind of focused attention he'd never once given to anything I'd said. And there was Mila, sitting somewhat awkwardly in a chair that had clearly been pulled in from the dining room, looking like she was trying to make herself invisible. When our eyes met, she gave me a small, encouraging smile that felt like a lifeline. Nobody looked up when I entered. Not immediately, anyway. Zach was too engrossed in describing the profit margins on his latest flip. Dad was too engrossed in Zach, and Sophie was too engrossed in whatever was happening on her Instagram feed. It was Mom who finally noticed me bustling in from the kitchen with a dish towel thrown over her shoulder and flour smudged on her cheek. She looked genuinely surprised to see me standing there as if she'd forgotten I was coming, despite the fact that we'd confirmed it 3 times over the past week. "Oh, Niki, you made it." There was that tone again, like my presence was an unexpected inconvenience rather than a planned part of their Christmas celebration. I held up my pie, still warm in its ceramic dish. "Apple pie, just like Grandma's recipe." Mom took it from my hands with a distracted, "Thank you, sweetie," but her attention was already drifting back toward the kitchen. She held the pie like it was just another dish to add to her growing collection of holiday obligations, not something I'd spent 3 hours making from scratch because I remembered it was Dad's favorite. "Where should I put these?" I asked, gesturing to the stack of gifts in my arms. "Oh, just anywhere under the tree is fine," Mom called over her shoulder, already disappearing back into the kitchen. "Dinner's almost ready. Everyone come eat." The transition from living room to dining room was like watching a carefully choreographed dance that I'd never learned the steps to. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were supposed to go, what they were supposed to do, how to navigate this familiar ritual. Except me. I followed the procession into the dining room, still carrying my gifts, because nobody had offered to help or shown any interest in what I'd brought. The dining room looked like something out of a holiday catalog. The table was set with Mom's good china, the kind that only came out for special occasions. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, and the centerpiece was an elaborate arrangement of white roses and evergreen branches that probably cost more than most people's weekly salary. And there were place cards. Elegant cream-colored cards with each person's name written in Mom's careful calligraphy, positioned at precise intervals around the table. I watched as everyone found their designated spots. Zach at Dad's right hand, of course, because he was the eldest son and the undisputed favorite. Amanda beside him. Sophie at Mom's right because she was the baby and therefore precious. Dad at the head of the table, Mom at the foot. Mila had been given a place between Sophie and the empty chair that I assumed was meant for me. But as I walked around the table looking for my name, a cold realization began to settle in my stomach. There were 12 place settings, 12 perfect arrangements of china and crystal and silverware, 12 chairs positioned around the table, but only 11 names on place cards. I counted again, certain I'd made a mistake. Zach, Amanda, Sophie, Dad, Mom, Mila. Then I noticed the others' extended family who'd been invited, but that I'd somehow missed in my initial survey. Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob, my cousins Jessica and Michael, and 2 more relatives whose names I didn't immediately recognize. 12 people invited to Christmas dinner. 11 place cards. I stood there for a moment, staring at the table, trying to process what I was seeing. Everyone else was settling into their assigned seats, unfolding napkins and reaching for water glasses, chatting about traffic and weather and all the mundane pleasantries that fill the space before a meal begins. Nobody seemed to notice that I was still standing. "Mom," I said, quietly, my voice barely carrying over the gentle din of conversation. "Where am I supposed to sit?" Mom looked up from adjusting a fork that was already perfectly aligned, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across her face. Not embarrassment exactly, more like mild annoyance at having her oversight pointed out. "Oh, sweetie," she said, her voice taking on that syrupy tone she used when she was about to deliver bad news wrapped in false kindness. "There just wasn't enough space at the table this year. We had so many people we wanted to include, and you know how it is with the seating arrangements." I looked around the table again, counting the faces. Half of these people I barely knew, relatives who showed up once a year, if that. Distant cousins who'd never expressed any interest in maintaining relationships with our family. But they all had place cards. They all had seats. "Maybe you could eat out back," Mom continued, gesturing vaguely toward the sunroom that adjoined the dining room. "Just for today, there's a TV tray out there and you'd be perfectly comfortable. It would actually be quieter, more peaceful." The words hit me like a physical blow. Eat out back. Like a dog. Like someone who didn't belong in the main house with the real family. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, waiting to see how I'd react to this casual banishment. The conversation had died, completely replaced by the kind of charged silence that precedes either explosive confrontation or complete surrender. Zach leaned back in his chair, and I caught the smirk that played at the corners of his mouth. He was enjoying this. Of course he was. This was exactly the kind of public humiliation he'd been orchestrating my entire life, and now it was happening in front of an audience. "Why waste a seat?" he said with a shrug, his voice carrying just enough mock confusion to maintain plausible deniability. "I mean, Niki's always been more of a loner anyway. She probably prefers eating alone." Amanda laughed, a light tinkling sound that somehow managed to be both musical and cruel. "It's actually kind of sweet having your own little space, like a reading nook, but for eating." Sophie looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting between me and her phone like she was trying to decide whether to engage or retreat into social media. Dad was studying his napkin with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for tax documents. But it was Mila's face that broke my heart. She was staring at me with wide eyes, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. She'd known my family was dysfunctional. We'd talked about it extensively. But I don't think she'd ever witnessed it firsthand. The casual cruelty, the systematic exclusion, the way they could make someone disappear while sitting right in front of them. "Niki, Mila started to say, half rising from her chair. You can have my seat. I don't mind. No, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I'd expected. It's fine. And here's the thing that surprised everyone, including myself. I didn't cry, I didn't argue, I didn't launch into the passionate defense I'd rehearsed in my head 1,000 times over the years. I didn't beg for inclusion, or point out the obvious injustice, or make a scene that would let them dismiss me as dramatic. Instead, I walked calmly to the Christmas tree in the corner of the dining room where my carefully wrapped gifts sat in a neat pile. I knelt down and found the one I'd brought specifically for Zach, the one wrapped in innocent red and green paper that gave no hint of what lay beneath. Actually, before we eat, I said, standing up with Zach's gift in my hands. I wanted to give Zach his present. I've been so excited about this one. Mom clapped her hands together with forced enthusiasm. Oh, how lovely! You know how much we enjoy the gift exchange. I walked around the table to where Zach sat, still wearing that self-satisfied smirk, still basking in the glow of my public humiliation. He looked up at me with lazy confidence, probably expecting another handmade scarf or picture frame or some other desperate attempt to win his approval. This is really special, Zach, I said, setting the package down in front of him. I put a lot of thought into it. He picked up the gift with theatrical excitement, shaking it gently next to his ear. Feels important. Heavy. Open it. I encouraged my voice, calm and steady. Everyone watched as Zach tore through the wrapping paper with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never met a gift he didn't love. The paper fell away to reveal a simple cardboard box, the kind you might use to mail documents. Inside the box, cushioned by tissue paper, was a small black USB drive. Attached to it with a piece of ribbon was a folded note card. Zach held up the USB drive, looking genuinely puzzled. What is it? Read the note, I suggested. He unfolded the card and read aloud, For Zach, a collection of memories. Some things are worth preserving forever. The confusion on his face was genuine, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. He had no idea what was coming. None of them did. I don't understand, he said, turning the USB drive over in his palm. What kind of memories? I smiled at him, and for the first time in years, it felt like a real smile. Not the careful, hopeful expression I usually wore around my family, but something genuine and calm and completely unafraid. Why don't you plug it into your laptop? I suggested. I think you'll find it very interesting. Zach glanced around the table, clearly wondering if this was some kind of joke he wasn't getting. Amanda shrugged, equally confused. Mom was looking between us with growing concern, her maternal instincts finally kicking in, just in time to sense that something was shifting in the room's atmosphere. My laptop's upstairs, Zach said slowly. That's okay, I replied. We can wait. I'm not going anywhere. There was something in my tone that made everyone pay attention. Not anger, not hurt, not the desperate pleading they were used to hearing from me. Just a quiet certainty that suggested this moment was important in ways they didn't yet understand. Zach must have heard it too, because his smirk faded slightly. For the first time since I'd arrived, he was looking at me like I was someone who might actually matter. Actually, I continued, reaching into my purse. I brought my phone. We can just use that. I pulled out my iPhone and connected the USB drive with a small adapter I'd brought specifically for this purpose. The files loaded quickly, and I scrolled through them for a moment, selecting exactly what I wanted everyone to hear first. These are some recordings I've been collecting over the years, I explained conversationally as if I were discussing the weather. You know how I am about documentation. It's the journalist in me, I suppose. The first recording started to play, and Zach's voice filled the dining room with crystal clarity. She always takes the bait. All I have to do is hint at her being unstable, and Mom folds like origami. It's almost too easy. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop, a heartbeat, a prayer. Every face around the table went pale. Every expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something approaching horror. But I wasn't done. Not even close. That was from last Easter, I said, calmly scrolling to the next file. But I have so many more. Years worth, actually. The second recording began to play, and this time it was Mom's voice talking to her sister on the phone. I just don't know what to do with Niki. She's so sensitive about everything. Sometimes I think it would be easier if she just found her own thing for the holidays. You know, let the rest of us enjoy ourselves without walking on eggshells. I looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. Some looked away quickly, unable to hold my gaze. Others stared back with expressions of shock, guilt, or dawning understanding. I have recordings of phone calls, text message, screenshots, emails, voicemails. I continued in the same conversational tone. 3 years worth of documentation. Ever since I started therapy and Dr. Kwan suggested I might want to keep track of patterns. Zach's face had gone completely white. You recorded us. That's illegal. Actually, it's not, I replied calmly. I'm a journalist, remember. I know the laws about recording. And besides, most of these were recorded in public places, or during family gatherings, where there was no expectation of privacy. I paused the playback and looked around the table again. Would you like to hear more? I have some particularly interesting conversations about my sexuality, my career choices, and various theories about my mental health. There's also a fascinating discussion about whether I'd even notice if I wasn't invited to Sophie's birthday party last year. Sophie made a small sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Niki, I wanted to invite you. I swear I did. I know you did, Sophie, I said gently. That conversation is on here too. You standing up for me and being told that it would be better for everyone if I wasn't there. The room was so quiet, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, counting off the seconds as my family processed what they were hearing, what they were learning about themselves. But the most beautiful part, the part that made all of this worth it, was that I felt completely calm. No racing heart, no sweaty palms, no desperate need to explain myself or apologize for taking up space. I was simply standing in my truth, letting it speak for itself. The thing is, I continued, I'm not even angry anymore. I used to be. I used to lie awake at night, wondering what was wrong with me, why I couldn't earn your love, why nothing I did ever seemed to matter. But therapy is a wonderful thing. It helped me understand that this isn't about me at all. I gestured around the table, at the beautiful place settings, and the empty chair that had never been meant for me anyway. This is about you. About the choices you've made, the patterns you've created, the family dynamic you've built and maintained for decades. And I'm done pretending it's anything other than what it is. Zach found his voice first, though it came out as more of a croak. You're sick. This is sick. Recording your own family like some kind of spy. I smiled at him again, that same calm, genuine smile. You know what's sick. Zach systematically sabotaging your sister for 30 years. Destroying her relationships, diminishing her achievements, and convincing everyone around her that she's the problem. I turned to address the whole table, my voice carrying easily in the stunned silence. But here's what I realized. I don't need a seat at this table. I never did. Because this table, this family, this whole setup was never meant to include me. Not really. I was just supposed to be grateful for the scraps, thankful for the bare minimum, and quiet about everything else. I picked up the USB drive and slipped it back into my purse. So I'm not going to eat in the sunroom like a family pet. I'm not going to smile and pretend this is normal. And I'm not going to spend one more Christmas making myself small enough to fit into spaces that were never designed for me. I walked to the front hall and picked up my coat, pulling it on with steady hands, while my family sat in stunned silence behind me. The recordings will make an interesting addition to my therapy sessions. I called back to them. Dr. Kwan has been helping me understand generational patterns of dysfunction. This will give her so much to work with. I opened the front door, letting the cold December air rush in and turned back one last time. Merry Christmas, everyone. Enjoy your dinner. And then I walked out into the snow, closing the door behind me on 30 years of trying to belong somewhere I was never actually wanted. My phone was already buzzing with text messages before I reached my car, but I didn't look at them. Not yet. First, I needed to drive to the hotel where I'd made a reservation just in case. I needed to order room service and call Mila, and maybe cry a little, not from sadness, but from relief. I needed to sit with the fact that I'd finally done it. I'd finally stopped shrinking. And for the first time in my life, I felt exactly the right size. But I didn't leave. Not yet. I stood there in the doorway for a moment, my hand still on the door handle, listening to the chaos erupting behind me. Voices, overlapping chairs, scraping against hardwood, the sound of someone crying. And underneath it all, Zach's voice getting louder and more desperate as he tried to regain control of a situation that was spiraling completely beyond his reach. I closed the door and turned around. Actually, I said, walking back into the dining room where my family sat in various states of shock and confusion, I'm not done yet. I approached the table calmly, my steps measured and deliberate. Every eye in the room followed me, as I moved like I was some kind of dangerous animal they weren't sure how to handle, which, in a way, I suppose I was. For the first time in my life, I was unpredictable. I wasn't following the script they'd written for me. Zach, I said, my voice carrying easily through the stunned silence. I brought you something special. Mom's voice cut through the air, high and strained. Niki, please, not now. We're about to eat. Can't this wait until after dinner? I looked at her. Really, looked at her and saw something I'd never noticed before. Fear. She was afraid of me, afraid of what I might say or do. After 30 years of dismissing me, ignoring me, treating me like an inconvenience, she was finally paying attention. And she didn't like what she was seeing. Now is exactly the time, Mom, I replied. In fact, now is the only time, because I'm not going to be here for any other time. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the files I'd so carefully organized over the past 3 years. Audio recordings, screenshots of text messages, forwarded emails, voicemails saved in digital perpetuity. A comprehensive archive of exactly who my family really was when they thought I wasn't listening. Let me share some of my favorites, I said, selecting the first file. This one's from last Thanksgiving, about an hour after I left early because of a headache. Zach's voice filled the room again, but this time everyone was paying attention. This time, there was nowhere to hide. Thank God she left early. I was running out of ways to shut her up about that stupid journalism award. Like anyone cares that she wrote some article about housing or whatever. Mom, you really need to stop encouraging her delusions of grandeur. Mom's gasp was audible, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to echo in the suddenly too quiet room. But I wasn't finished. I had so much more to share. I scrolled to the next recording. Mom's voice this time, talking to Aunt Linda on the phone while I was supposedly upstairs packing to leave. I just don't understand why she has to make everything about her. Sophie brings home a boyfriend, and Niki has to mention her girlfriend. Zach talks about his business, and Niki has to bring up her job. It's exhausting, Linda. Sometimes I wonder if she's just desperate for attention, because she knows she can't compete. Sophie started to cry. Not the delicate, pretty tears of someone who's slightly overwhelmed, but the ugly, choking sobs of someone whose world is suddenly making terrible sense. She'd always wondered why family gatherings felt so tense, why I always seemed sad afterward, why there were undercurrents she couldn't quite identify. Now she knew. There's more, I said gently, switching to a text message thread I'd screenshotted just last month. This is a conversation between Mom and Zach about whether to invite me to your birthday dinner, Sophie. I read aloud from the screen. Mom to Zach. Should we invite Niki to Sophie's birthday? She'll just find something to complain about. Zach to Mom. Why bother? She never seems to enjoy herself anyway. Plus, Amanda doesn't really like her. Mom to Zach. You're right. We'll keep it small this year. Sophie's crying intensified and she looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. Niki, I swear I didn't know. I asked Mom why you weren't there and she said you were busy with work. I know you didn't know, sweetie, I said softly. You're not the problem here. That's when Alicia spoke up. My cousin Alicia, who'd been sitting quietly through this entire revelation, suddenly found her voice. You know what? She said, her words cutting through Sophie's sobs. This explains so much. Zach, do you remember when Grandma's watch went missing when we were teenagers? Zach's face went white. Alicia, don't. No, I think we should talk about this, Alicia continued, her voice gaining strength. Because I was there. I saw you take it from her jewelry box during the funeral reception, and I watched you plant it in Niki's purse. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a dust mote hit the floor. Every person at that table was staring at Zach with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to dawning comprehension. I was 17, Alicia went on, and I was scared to say anything because you were older, and everyone always believed you over everyone else. But I never forgot. And when Grandma accused Niki of stealing it, when the whole family turned against her, when she cried for hours and no one would listen to her, I felt sick. I've felt sick about it for 15 years. Alicia, you're misremembering, Zach said desperately. That's not what happened. I know exactly what happened, Alicia shot back. And so do you. You stole Grandma's watch, you let the Niki take the blame, and you watched our entire family vilify her for something you did. She was 18 years old, Zach. 18. I felt something break open inside my chest, but it wasn't pain. It was relief, validation, the knowledge that I hadn't been crazy or oversensitive or imagining things. There had been witnesses to at least some of it, and finally someone else was speaking up. And that's just one incident, I said, pulling up another file on my phone. I have documentation going back years. Zach telling my high school boyfriend that I was promiscuous. Zach convincing my college roommate that I was unstable. Zach sabotaging my job interviews by calling companies and warning them about my psychological issues. That's impossible, Dad said, speaking for the first time since this all began. Zachary wouldn't do something like that. Dad, I said, turning to face him directly. I can play you the voicemail he left for the editor at the Tribune when I was applying for my first real journalism job. He identified himself as my concerned brother and suggested they might want to do a more thorough background check because I had a history of fabricating stories for attention. Dad's face crumpled. He aged 10 years in that moment, the weight of what he was learning settling into the lines around his eyes. I turned back to Mom, who was sitting rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. And you, Mom? I said, my voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. Every time I tried to tell you what was happening, you shut me down. You told me I was being dramatic. You said I was reading too much into things. You made me believe that the problem was my perception, not their behavior. Niki, let me finish, I interrupted. Because this is important. You didn't just fail to protect me from Zach's sabotage. You actively enabled it. Every time I came to you for help, you gaslighted me. You made me question my own reality. So do you have any idea what that does to a person? Mom's carefully applied makeup was starting to run as tears leaked from her eyes. I thought I was keeping the peace. I thought if we just didn't make a big deal about things. You thought wrong, I said simply. You chose Zach's comfort over my safety. You chose to avoid conflict over protecting your daughter. And you did it over and over again for 30 years. Zach finally exploded. He slammed his fist on the table, making the crystal glasses jump, and Amanda gasped in surprise. You're sick, he shouted, his face red with rage and panic. Recording your own family like some kind of psychopath. You need help, Niki. Serious, professional help. The old me would have flinched. The old me would have apologized, would have tried to explain, would have backed down in the face of his anger. But the old me had died somewhere between the therapist's office and this dining room table. The new me just smiled. I got help, Zach. I said, my voice steady and clear. That's exactly why I'm standing here. 3 years of therapy taught me to recognize gaslighting when I see it. It taught me to document patterns of abuse. It taught me that I don't have to accept being treated like garbage just because we share DNA. I looked around the table one more time, meeting each person's eyes in turn. Dr. Kwan helped me understand that healthy families don't operate the way this one does. In healthy families, people don't systematically destroy each other. They don't exclude family members from gatherings. They don't sabotage each other's relationships and careers. They don't gaslight each other into questioning their own reality. I paused, letting that sink in. She also taught me something else. She taught me that I have a choice. I can keep coming back here, keep hoping for scraps of love from people who have shown me repeatedly that they're incapable of giving it. Or I can walk away and build relationships with people who actually value me. But we're your family, Mom whispered, her voice broken. Family forgives. Family works through things. No, Mom, I said gently. Family protects each other. Family builds each other up. Family creates safe spaces where everyone can be themselves without fear. This isn't family. This is just a group of people who happen to be related, and some of those people have been systematically abusing one of the others for decades. Zach's voice was desperate now, all his usual confidence stripped away. You can't just throw away 30 years of family history over some misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Zach, I have you on tape describing me as the family mistake and discussing strategies for making sure I don't get too comfortable at family events. I have documented evidence of you sabotaging my relationships, my career, and my mental health. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a pattern of deliberate psychological abuse. The fight went out of him then. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time in my life, Zach looked smaller than me. Diminished. Like a man who just realized that all his secrets had been exposed and there was nowhere left to hide. The really sad part, I continued, is that I spent so many years thinking I was the problem, thinking that if I could just be better, smarter, more successful, more agreeable, you'd finally love me. But you never could you? Because loving me would have meant admitting that you'd been wrong about me from the beginning. I put my phone back in my purse and looked at my family one last time. Some were crying. Some were staring at their plates. Some were looking at me like they were seeing me for the first time. I'm not angry anymore, I said, and I realized as I said it that it was true. I'm just done. Done pretending this is normal. Done making excuses for behavior that would be unacceptable in any other relationship. Done shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. I walked toward the door again, but this time, I knew I wouldn't be coming back. Niki, wait. Sophie called out, her voice thick with tears. Please don't go. We can fix this. We can do better. I turned back to her. This little sister I'd loved and protected and worried about for 24 years. Sophie, I said softly, you can do better. You already are doing better, but this family, this system, this dynamic, it's not fixable. Because it's not broken. It's working exactly the way it was designed to work. There's a scapegoat, there's a golden child, there are enablers, and there are bystanders. Everyone plays their role perfectly. I looked at her with all the love I'd carried for her since the day she was born. But you don't have to keep playing your role. You can choose something different. You can choose to see people clearly, instead of accepting the stories you've been told about them. You can choose to speak up when you see injustice instead of staying silent to keep the peace. Sophie nodded through her tears, and I saw something shift in her expression. Understanding, maybe. Or determination. Either way, it gave me hope. I love you, Sophie, I said. I love the person you really are, not the person this family has trained you to be. If you ever want to know your sister, really know her, you have my number. And then I walked out of that house and into the snow, leaving 30 years of family dysfunction behind me. My phone started buzzing immediately with texts and calls, but I didn't look at them. Instead, I drove to the hotel where I'd made a reservation, just in case this moment ever came. I checked and ordered room service and called Mila. How did it go? She asked as soon as she picked up. I think I said, looking out the window at the snow falling on a world that suddenly felt full of possibilities. I think I just saved my own life. And for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't waiting for anyone else to rescue me. I'd rescued myself. I stepped away from the table, away from the stunned faces, and the half-eaten dinner, and the beautiful place settings that had never included a spot for me anyway. The silence behind me was deafening, broken only by Sophie's quiet sobs and the sound of chairs scraping against the hardwood floor as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I'm not hungry anymore," I said simply, and somehow those 4 words carried the weight of 30 years of trying to belong somewhere I was never truly welcome. I walked through the front hall, past the family photos that told the story of our lives with me, carefully edited out of most of the important moments. Past the coat closet where I'd hung my hopes so many times before. Past the mirror where I'd practiced smiles that might finally earn their approval. The front door closed behind me with a soft click, and suddenly I was standing in the snow, breathing in air that felt cleaner somehow. Lighter. The weight I'd been carrying for decades had lifted, and I felt like I might float away if I wasn't careful. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, engine running heat slowly warming the interior. Through the frost-covered windows, I could see the warm glow of the dining room where my family was presumably trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wondered if they'd even finish dinner or if they'd sit there in uncomfortable silence poking at their food while avoiding eye contact. But honestly, it didn't matter anymore. Their reactions, their feelings, their ability to understand what had just transpired, none of it was my responsibility. For the first time in my life, I was free from the burden of managing their emotions about my existence. As I drove through the quiet suburban streets, Christmas lights twinkling in windows, and families gathered around their own tables, I found myself thinking about something Dr. Kwan had said months ago. "They never made space for you, Niki, but that doesn't mean you can't make your own space." They never made space for me, but I could make my own table. The thought followed me through the snowy streets, past the houses full of families, who hopefully treated each other with more kindness than mine ever had. I drove toward the hotel where I'd made a reservation, toward a quiet room where I could finally breathe, without worrying about anyone else's comfort. The Hampton Inn wasn't exactly luxury accommodations, but it felt like a palace compared to the emotional prison I'd just escaped. The lobby was decorated for Christmas, with a modest tree and some garland, and the woman at the front desk smiled at me like I was a person worth being kind to. "Checking in?" she asked cheerfully. "Yes. Niki Patterson." "Perfect. We have you in a king room on the 3rd floor. How long will you be staying with us?" I paused, realizing I hadn't actually decided. "I'm not sure yet. Is that okay?" "Of course, just let us know when you're ready to check out." "When I'm ready." What a novel concept. My room was simple, but clean, with a big window that looked out over the town where I'd grown up but never really belonged. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally looked at my phone, which had been buzzing constantly since I left the house. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, a voicemail box that was probably full. I scrolled through the messages without opening them, just reading the preview lines. Most were from mom, variations on "please come back" and "we need to talk" and "you're being dramatic." A few from dad, shorter and more confused. "Don't understand what happened," and "call me." But then I saw one from Sophie that made me stop scrolling. "I want to know the real you. I'm sorry." I opened that one and read the full message. "Niki, I don't know what to say except that I'm sorry. I'm sorry I never saw what was happening. I'm sorry I was part of a system that hurt you. I'm sorry it took me this long to understand. I know you probably need space right now, but when you're ready, I want to know who you really are. Not the version of you that this family created, but the real you. I love you." I sat there staring at that message for a long time, feeling something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness would take time and work and proof of change. But hope. The possibility that not every relationship from my old life had to be lost. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. I looked through the peephole and smiled for the first time all day. Mila stood in the hallway holding a bag from the convenience store and wearing the most beautiful expression of relief I'd ever seen. I opened the door and fell into her arms, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of what I'd just done. The fear, the exhaustion, the strange lightness of being free. "You did it," she whispered into my hair. "You actually did it." "I did it," I agreed, and started laughing. Not hysterical laughter, but the kind of deep, genuine joy that comes from finally standing up for yourself. We spent the evening curled up on the hotel bed, drinking hot chocolate from styrofoam cups and debriefing everything that had happened. Mila listened while I replayed every moment, every expression, every word that had been said. She held me when I cried, not from sadness but from relief. She celebrated with me when I felt proud of my courage. "What happens now?" she asked as we were getting ready for bed. "Now I build my own table," I said, and I knew exactly what that meant. 6 months later, I was standing in my kitchen, putting the finishing touches on a 4th of July dinner that I was hosting in my own apartment. My teal walls looked beautiful in the warm evening light, and my dining table extended with a card table to accommodate. Everyone was set with mismatched plates and glasses that somehow looked more beautiful than any perfectly coordinated place setting I'd ever seen. The menu was simple: grilled burgers, corn on the cob, watermelon salad, and a flag cake that Mila and I had spent the afternoon decorating with strawberries and blueberries. Nothing fancy, nothing designed to impress anyone. Just good food, shared with people I loved. Sophie arrived first, carrying a huge bowl of potato salad and looking nervous but determined. She'd been coming to therapy herself for the past few months, working through her own relationship with our family and the role she'd played in the dysfunction. It wasn't easy work, but she was doing it. "This looks amazing," she said, looking around my apartment with genuine admiration. "I love what you've done with the place." "Thanks. It feels like home." And it did. Every plant I'd nurtured, every book I'd arranged, every photo I'd chosen to display, it all reflected who I actually was rather than who someone else wanted me to be. Mila arrived next with wine and flowers, followed by 3 of my colleagues from work who'd become real friends over the past year. People who knew my worth, who celebrated my successes, who created space for me without being asked. And then just as we were about to sit down to eat, there was another knock at the door. I opened it to find Dad standing in the hallway holding a pie that looked suspiciously like the apple pie I used to make for family gatherings. "I hope it's okay that I came," he said quietly. "Sophie gave me your address. I brought dessert." We looked at each other for a long moment. He looked older, more tired than I remembered. The past 6 months had clearly been difficult for him too, watching his family fracture and having to confront some uncomfortable truths about the dynamics he'd enabled for decades. "It's okay," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "But Dad, you need to understand something. This isn't about going back to the way things were. This is about starting over if that's something you actually want to do." He nodded his eyes, taking in my apartment. My life, the evidence of who I'd become when I stopped trying to fit into his idea of who I should be. "I want to try," he said simply. "I want to know who you really are." So we sat around my extended dining table, this odd collection of people who'd chosen to be there, who'd chosen each other. We talked and laughed and shared stories that had nothing to do with old grievances or family roles or the weight of history. For the first time in my life, I was sitting at a table where everyone was genuinely happy to see me, where my voice mattered, where I didn't have to perform or prove or apologize for existing. As the evening wound down and people started to head home, Sophie lingered to help with the dishes. "Thank you," she said as we loaded the dishwasher together. "For what? For showing me what's possible, for proving that we don't have to keep playing the same roles forever." I hugged her, this sister I was slowly getting to know for the first time. We get to choose, Sophie. We get to decide what kind of relationships we want to have. After everyone left, Mila and I sat on my couch looking at the remnants of a perfect evening. Dirty plates stacked in the sink, empty wine glasses on the coffee table, the lingering scent of good food and better conversation. "How do you feel?" Mila asked. I thought about it for a moment, trying to find the right words for what I was experiencing. Peace, joy, the absence of anxiety that had been my constant companion for so many years. Full, I said finally. Not from the food, though, that was great, but full in a way I've never been before. Like I finally have enough. I looked around my little apartment with its teal walls and thriving plants and the dining table that had held everyone who mattered to me. This space I'd created, this life I'd built, these relationships I'd chosen. "You know what I realized tonight," I said. "What's that? Sometimes the best seat at the table is the one you build yourself." And sitting there in my own space, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived on my own terms, I knew that was the truest thing I'd ever said. I'd spent 30 years begging for a place at someone else's table, accepting scraps, making myself smaller to fit into spaces that were never designed for me. But I didn't need their table anymore. I had my own now, and it was exactly the right size. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own self-worth? What would you have done in Niki's situation? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories about finding the courage to stand up for yourself, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.